October 14, 1997, Queen Elizabeth II made a state visit to the Sikh holy city of Amritsar in northwest India. Despite the exuberant welcome, the Queen faced one of the most difficult moments of her reign. Part of the visit involved walking down a narrow alley to the enclosed Jallianwala Bagh compound. 78 years earlier, on April 13, 1919, 379 defenseless people were killed without warning by a unit of soldiers commanded by a senior British officer. Another 1,200 were badly wounded. The victims were among an unarmed crowd of over 5,000 who gathered to protest political restrictions imposed by the British, including a ban on public meetings. The massacre signaled a turning point in Anglo-Indian relations. This moment of madness changed most Indians' perception of the British. "80 years later, the British Queen and Duke of Edinburgh stood in silent respect before a memorial to the innocent victims of that dreadful day. Earlier, when Queen Elizabeth arrived in Delhi, an angry group of demonstrators had demanded that she formally apologize for the massacre. They were quickly scattered by a water cannon. Unlike the 1919 incident, the authorities no longer dispersed crowds with rifle fire. In 1919, the British in India became understandably tense and nervous. Riots erupted across the country. People took to the streets to protest a draconian set of measures known as the Rowlatt Acts. Among other things, the acts proposed political trials without juries, holding suspects without trial, and a ban on public meetings. Many Indians tried passive resistance, but they were met with sticks and clubs, not just from the police and British soldiers, but from fellow Indians who worked for the British. Resentment of the rough treatment began to grow. In Amritsar, however, the protests turned violent. Mrs. Beckett, wife of the assistant commissioner, remembers.
Well, the terrible thing was we were in darkness with no light. And the city, the Indian city, was a blaze of light. And they were all shouting the joy over the people they'd murdered that day.
A British Army officer, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, was brought in from Lahore to reinstate order in the riot-torn city. When he heard the news that a crowd was assembling in the Jallianwala compound, Dyer decided to give them a lesson they'd never forget. He marched his men down the alley into the compound. There would be no escaping for this unruly mob. Dyer led a group of 100 Gurkhas, tough, unsentimental soldiers recruited from the mountains of Nepal to join the British-run Indian Army. Upon entering the compound, Dyer regretted that the entrance was too narrow for his armored cars. He knew their machine guns would have been more devastating than rifles. As the crowds milled about the dusty compound, they were startled to hear marching feet. To their surprise, a group of armed soldiers led by Dyer filed through the entrance and positioned themselves on either side. It was meant to be a peaceful demonstration. The people wanted to voice their concerns with the Rowlatt Acts. The protesters were silent, waiting to see what would happen next. An order to disperse was then given. Moments later, a shot rang out, followed by a volley. Instantly, panic and pandemonium erupted. Those at the front fell in bloody heaps. Meanwhile, those at the back had mistaken the gunfire for blank warning shots and surged forward. Unfortunately, the shots were real. The soldiers kept firing for a full 10 minutes until they ran out of ammunition. There was no mercy and no escape for the helpless Indians. Some sought safety by jumping into a deep well, but were killed when they hit the bottom. Dyer surveyed the massive carnage. Although he knew there might be repercussions, he felt he had done his duty. Up until her death in 1901, Queen Victoria was Empress of India, but had never visited the country. But in 1911, her grandson, George V, did. He described his great ceremonial reception as the most beautiful and wonderful sight he had ever seen. By then, political change was in the air. Many in the new Indian middle class, itself created by the British system of education, now wanted more power for the National Congress Party, which was founded in 1885. Indians were tired of being governed from distant London and bitterly resented that the minority British in India ruled a population of 350 million. Many Britons realized they could not hold India forever, despite sweeping changes they had made to its society and infrastructure. Even years after India gained independence, it would retain Britain's civil service, judicial system, and efficient, if grossly overcrowded, railways. Britain's occupation of India began in the mid-18th century under the auspices of the East India Company, which had been trading there since 1600. British authority was exercised through a succession of governor-generals, one of whom was James Ramsay. In the mid-19th century, Ramsay introduced a series of reforms, one of which outlawed the ceremonial burning of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre. Soldiers in the Indian Army were deeply suspicious of such changes. They felt the British didn't understand their religious sensitivities. A prime example of this was a rumor that Indian soldiers were issued cartridges greased either with cow fat, which was offensive to Hindus, or pig fat, which was offensive to Muslims. This resentment finally boiled over. On May 10, 1857, the British government was shocked when 3 Indian Army regiments mutinied. The rebels seized the city of Delhi. They named the 82-year-old Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II their leader. Revolts spread through the country with dreadful results. At Kanpur, in Uttar Pradesh, the mutineers mercilessly slaughtered nearly 1,000 British men, women, and children. Over a year passed before the uprising was put down. British retribution was swift and brutal, and many of the mutineers were executed. Some were cruelly strapped to the front of a cannon and blown to bits. At the turn of the century, with Queen Victoria as Empress, India once more seemed securely under British rule. The country was now governed by a succession of viceroys. Their titles gave them authority over 1/6 of the human race. The viceroy's authority was reinforced by nearly 2,000 members of the Indian civil service. Most were recruited from the elite private schools and universities of Britain. The British also supplied 10,000 officers to the Indian Army. Young men from Britain now governed over areas populated by as many as 800,000 Indians. The Indian Army, most of whom were Punjabis and Sikhs, was fanatically loyal to the British. The British were also supported by India's 660 pampered princes. Between them, they ruled over 2/5 of the entire country. The majority of India's population consisted of peasants in rural areas with little understanding of national politics. This was the heyday of the Raj, or British government in India. Life was very agreeable. There was time for recreation, such as hunting tigers, or relaxing in the hills of Simla. When World War I began in 1914, thousands of Indians joined the British on the battlefront. Many considered it almost a sacred duty, but were confused when the war was not quickly won. Even India's Congress Party, which led the call for Indian self-rule, supported the war effort. Many middle-class Indians believed that by showing loyalty to Britain, they would achieve independence even quicker. "62,000 Indians lost their lives in World War I. Many of those who survived felt they had fought as equals with the British on the battlefields of Europe and should be treated as such when they returned home. Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India, also felt India should be granted some form of home rule. His views were shared by Lord Chelmsford, the Viceroy. In 1919, Mahatma Gandhi returned to India after spending much of his life in South Africa. The Congress Party now had a strong leader. This gentle, mild-mannered lawyer would have a monumental influence over India's future. At first, Gandhi was not opposed to the British. Soon, he dominated the Indian National Congress Party and became responsible for the eventual transition of the British Empire. Sensing the unrest and confusion among ordinary Indians, Gandhi appealed directly to them by preaching the twin virtues of poverty and abstinence. He told them the best way to resist the British was in a passive and peaceful manner. They were no match for the military might of the Raj. But he could not quell growing anger toward British rule. Across the northwest frontier of India, these events were watched with interest by the Afghans. Fierce Afghan tribesmen awaited a widespread rebellion so they could cross the border and attack the British in what would have been the third Afghan war since 1838. In early April 1919, India erupted in protest against the Rowlatt Acts, imposed by the British to replace wartime restrictions. But the acts seemed to impose more limits on the Indians. The trouble was at its worst in the northern Punjab cities of Lahore and Amritsar. There, police and the army struggled to maintain order. In Amritsar, a British missionary named Miss Sherwood was brutally assaulted and left for dead. Events were heading toward a bloody confrontation in Amritsar. What was about to happen would change India's perception of the British forever. On April 13th, 1919, a crowd began to gather in the Jallianwala Bagh compound in Amritsar. Here, Britain's Brigadier General Reginald Dyer committed the blunder that would create unexpected repercussions. He led the Gurkhas down the narrow entrance, cutting off any chance of escape for the assembled Indians. After a warning, the Gurkhas opened fire, stopping only when they ran out of ammunition. 379 people were killed and another 1,200 badly wounded. News of the massacre was greeted with horror and disbelief. Winston Churchill, Britain's Secretary of State for War, knew he had to act decisively. Dyer was recalled, subjected to a formal inquiry, and dismissed from the army. But many politicians and military men in India and Britain were outraged by the verdict. They felt Dyer should have been honored for his action rather than forced out of the army. A British newspaper, the Morning Post, began a fund for Dyer and raised £26,000 within a few weeks. Rudyard Kipling, the writer, donated £10. He had been born in India and was a true son of the empire. Churchill stood firm against the criticism. Anti-British sentiment among the Indian nationalists was running high. If left unchecked, there would be an even greater Indian bloodbath. In 1921, the Duke of Connaught, George V's brother, made a state visit to India. The Duke had been commander-in-chief of the Indian Army from 1886 to 1900 and had a special affection for the country. During his visit, he stated how much he deplored the Amritsar massacre. But the British were determined to retain control of India. As if to reinforce their dominance there, they built New Delhi, an arrogant reminder of the empire's might. The British were deluding themselves. Even 12 years later, the massacre at Amritsar still cast a long, dark shadow. Gandhi continued his campaign for Indian independence. In March 1931, he led thousands of his followers 240 miles to the sea to protest the British tax on salt, an essential part of the Indian diet. Six months later, Gandhi was invited to London to discuss the future of India. The British press and public were fascinated by this man who had become such a thorn in the side to the British establishment. But despite Gandhi's peaceful intentions, the violence in India continued. When World War II began in 1939, thousands of Indians fought with the British, just as they had in World War I. Many received medals for their bravery, including the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for gallantry. At the end of the war in 1945, India's National Congress Party was now led by Jawaharlal Nehru. Educated in Britain, he stepped up the campaign for India's complete independence. In February 1947, Lord Louis Mountbatten was appointed the last Viceroy of India. His job was to prepare the country for independence in August of that year. But if anything, the violence preceding independence worsened. Hindus and Muslims, India's two main religious groups, fought for dominance in the new India. Appalling atrocities were committed on both sides. Thousands of people died a bloody death. Finally, the day of independence dawned. India said farewell to its last viceroy, and Lord Mountbatten presided over India's final imperial occasion. Nehru was sworn in as India's first Prime Minister. A few seconds after midnight, on August 15, 1947, the British flag was taken down and replaced with the new flag of India. The road to India's independence had been long and bloody, but it was now complete. Future British monarchs would visit India as Commonwealth heads rather than rulers. 80 years after the massacre at Amritsar, it was clear that the tragic British blunder had played a significant role in history.